When Clint Eastwood walked onto the set of the Emma Clarke Show, the audience expected just another Hollywood interview. What they didn't know was that Emma, a sharp-tongued progressive host, had a plan. A takedown moment designed to humiliate the legendary actor and prove that his old-school masculinity was a relic of the past. But what happened next became one of the most unforgettable moments in television history. Because in true Clint Eastwood style, he didn't just respond, he took control. And with just a few words, he turned the entire conversation into the ultimate lesson on strength, wisdom, and the power of unshaken confidence. The studio lights burned bright, bouncing off the polished black stage floor. A low hum of anticipation filled the air as the audience settled in, their murmurs blending with the subtle whir of cameras adjusting their focus. Tonight was going to be big. This wasn't just any late-night interview. This was the Emma Clarke Show, a program known for its razor-sharp political edge, its viral headline-grabbing moments, and a host who thrived on confrontation. Emma Clarke, a self-assured, media-savvy progressive, had built her career on pushing boundaries and exposing so-called outdated ideologies. She had dismantled politicians, challenged CEOs, and turned once-revered figures into online punching bags. And tonight, she had her sights set on Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, a symbol of old-school masculinity, a man who had built an empire on stoic cowboys, hard men, and lone gunslingers who didn't apologize for their strength. Emma had prepared for this. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. Clint's westerns, his gritty, no-nonsense roles, were the perfect example of an era that progressives were eager to leave behind. Violence, masculinity, the lone hero complex. It was all outdated, and tonight, Emma was ready to make him say it. She could already see the headlines. Clint Eastwood admits his films are problematic. Hollywood's cowboy finally rides into the sunset. The audience cheered as Emma took her seat in the host's chair. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression warm but unmistakably confident. This was her arena, her game. Then, Clint walked in. The cheers swelled, but there was something different about it. It wasn't the kind of frenzied applause reserved for pop stars or politicians. It was respect. Clint, at 94, still towered in presence. His steps were slow, deliberate, his posture straight despite the years. He moved like a man who didn't need to demand attention. It followed him naturally. His weathered face, marked by time but untouched by insecurity, carried the same quiet intensity that had defined his career. He nodded to the crowd, offered a polite smile, and took his seat across from Emma. His expression? Unreadable. The cameras zoomed in. The air thickened. It was time. Emma started soft. The warm-up. "It's such an honor to have you here, Clint," she said, crossing her legs, her smile polished and professional. Clint gave a slow nod. "Pleasure." Her voice was smooth, practiced. "You've had one of the most legendary careers in Hollywood. Actor, director, producer. You've shaped the industry for decades. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Unforgiven, Gran Torino. Some of the most iconic films of all time." Clint nodded again, waiting. She continued, glancing at her cards as if easing into the conversation. "People love your work. It's timeless, really." Then, the shift. Emma leaned forward slightly, her tone taking on a subtle edge. "But times do change, don't they?" The audience chuckled lightly. They knew where this was going. Emma pressed on, her voice laced with controlled amusement. "You've built your career playing tough men, no-nonsense types, cowboys, soldiers, men who, well, let's just say, don't always fit into today's definition of masculinity." She let the words hang in the air. Clint remained still. Emma continued, carefully selecting her next move. "Now, obviously your films were a product of their time," she said, her expression unreadable but her intent crystal clear. "But Clint, do you ever look back and think, maybe it's time to move on from that era?" There it was. The audience chuckled, some nodding, sensing the bait. The cameras panned to Clint, waiting for a reaction. Would he laugh it off? Would he get defensive? Would he stumble over his words like so many guests had before? But Clint Eastwood wasn't like the others. Instead of rushing to answer, he let the silence stretch. The audience shifted in their seats. Emma's smirk remained, but a flicker of something crossed her eyes, a flash of uncertainty. Then, slowly, Clint leaned back. He reached for his water, took a measured sip, set the glass down. And finally, in a voice as steady as ever, he answered, "Move on from what exactly?" His tone was calm, unshaken, almost amused. The audience stilled. Emma blinked, and in that moment, the game had changed. A ripple of nervous chuckles moved through the audience, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that signaled amusement. It was anticipation. They knew Emma was setting up a trap, a carefully worded question designed to steer Clint into an admission, a confession, maybe even a moment of self-reflection, the kind that would be clipped, dissected, and turned into a viral headline. But Clint Eastwood wasn't playing along. Instead, he simply tilted his head, his gaze steady, and repeated, "Move on from what exactly?" It wasn't defensive, it wasn't aggressive. It was measured, like a man watching a storm roll in, but refusing to take cover. Emma smirked, mistaking his response for hesitation. "Well," she said, her tone light but calculated, "let's be honest. The world today isn't the world of your films. The rugged lone cowboy, the tough-as-nails detective, it's a bit out of place now, don't you think?" Clint didn't blink. She leaned forward slightly, sensing an opening. "Times have changed," she continued, her voice dripping with the certainty of someone who believed she was winning. "Audiences are looking for different kinds of heroes now. They want nuance, emotion, characters who are more evolved than the ones we saw in the old westerns." Clint shifted, just slightly, his weathered hands resting on the armrests of his chair. He took a slow sip of water, the kind of pause that, in any other setting, might have felt insignificant. But here, it commanded attention. Emma's smirk twitched. She was used to guests scrambling, rushing to justify themselves, to prove that they weren't stuck in the past. But Clint? He didn't rush, he didn't flinch, he didn't care. Instead, after a long beat, he set his glass down, laced his fingers together, and in that same steady, gravelly voice, he said, "You say times have changed." A pause. "But people still tell the same stories, don't they?" The room fell silent. Emma blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." Clint gave a small, knowing smile. "They still make movies about good and evil, about justice, about standing up when no one else will. The only difference now?" He let his voice drop just slightly. "They just dressed the heroes up a little differently." The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Emma recovered quickly, flipping through her cards, adjusting her posture. She had to push harder. She had to regain control. Because she could feel it, Clint Eastwood wasn't just answering her questions, he was turning them back on her. Emma refused to lose. She had seen guests squirm under the heat of her questions. She had watched politicians stumble, actors shrink, CEOs trip over their own words. That was the beauty of this show. The host was in control. And she was about to remind Clint Eastwood of that. She straightened in her chair, her confidence returning. This was the moment. "Well," she said, flashing a knowing smile, "let's take a closer look at those stories, shall we?" With a subtle flick of her wrist, she gestured toward the massive screen behind them. The lights dimmed slightly and the screen lit up, a montage of Clint's most famous films rolling in quick succession. The gritty, sun-drenched landscapes of the Old West, a revolver spinning in his hand, a tight-lipped cowboy delivering justice with a bullet, a cop standing over a bleeding criminal muttering a cold, unrepentant one-liner. The audience chuckled nervously. Some nodded along, recognizing the scenes, the classic lines. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of whether they were supposed to be laughing. Emma let the montage play just long enough for the message to sink in. Then, with a quick cut, the screen went dark. She turned back to Clint, eyebrows raised. "I mean," she said, feigning casualness, "this was the kind of storytelling people loved. But don't you think we've outgrown it?" There it was, the final push. She leaned in, as if offering him one last chance to agree. "To be fair," she continued, her voice coated in mock sympathy, "I know these films were a product of their time, and they were wildly successful. But I guess my question is, do you really think this kind of masculinity still belongs in today's world?" The audience laughed again, but it was a different kind of laughter now. Uncertain, hesitant. All eyes were on Clint, Would he concede? Would he backtrack? The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail. The flicker of amusement in Clint's eyes, the slight curve of his lips, the complete and utter lack of concern on his face. He shifted slightly in his chair. Then, he smirked. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted again. The smirk on Clint's face was subtle, but it spoke volumes. For a moment, he let the tension settle, let the weight of the question hang in the air. Emma, still poised, still expectant, watched him carefully. She was waiting for the moment of surrender, the admission that his era had passed, that his brand of storytelling had been left behind. But Clint Eastwood wasn't here to surrender. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, gravelly, deliberate. "You know," he said, his tone casual but cutting, "it's funny." Emma blinked, waiting. "People used to love heroes." He paused, letting his words land. "Now they want to tear them down." The audience stilled. Emma's smirk flickered just for a second. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible, but Clint felt it. He straightened up, his posture effortless, yet somehow commanding the space. "See, you look at those films." He gestured toward the darkened screen behind them. "And you see violence, guns, tough men who don't say much." He glanced back at Emma, his gaze sharp. "And you think that's all there is?" Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "But you missed the part that mattered," he said, his voice growing just a little firmer. "Those stories, they weren't about violence. They were about honor, about courage, about men standing up when no one else would." A murmur rippled through the audience. Emma shifted in her seat. She wasn't used to losing control of the conversation, but Clint wasn't giving her an inch. "The reason those movies mattered," he continued, "the reason people still watch them, still talk about them, is because deep down, they know the truth." He let his gaze sweep the room, landing back on Emma. "People don't want to admit it, but they still want heroes. They still need them." The audience was no longer laughing. Emma recovered quickly, straightening in her chair. She wasn't about to let Clint dictate the conversation. She let out a small, controlled chuckle. "But Clint," she said, tilting her head, "surely you see how times have changed. We don't live in the Old West anymore. We don't need men with guns handling justice on their own." Clint exhaled softly, as if amused. "Let me tell you something about the Old West," he said. The room leaned in. "The frontier wasn't soft," he continued. "It wasn't kind, it wasn't safe." He fixed Emma with a steady gaze. "And if men like that hadn't existed, neither would the world we live in today." Silence. Emma blinked. Clint sat back in his chair, relaxed. "You sit here in this studio," he said, gesturing to the bright lights, the polished stage, the audience hanging on every word. "You have the luxury of saying we don't need men like that anymore. But that's because you're living in a world they built." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Emma tried to interject, sensing her control slipping. "But surely," Clint cut her off. Not with a raised voice, not with aggression, but with something even more powerful. Certainty. "My characters?" he said, tapping a finger on the armrest of his chair. "They always had a code. They didn't shoot first, they didn't start fights, but when the fight came to them, they finished it." A wave of applause broke out. Emma's expression tightened. Clint let the applause die down before he continued, his voice calm, steady. "You don't like those stories," he said, "because they remind you of something you don't want to face." He paused, his next words landing like a hammer. "The world isn't as civilized as you pretend it is." The audience was no longer on Emma's side. The studio air felt thicker now, heavy with an unspoken tension. The polished, calculated nature of the show, the one where Emma Clarke always held the upper hand, had begun to crack. Clint could feel it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the chair's armrests, his weathered hands steady as stone. His expression? Unmoved, unbothered, completely in control. "You keep saying outdated masculinity," he said, his voice as calm and gravelly as ever, while sitting in a studio built by tough people who didn't have the luxury of debating it. The words landed like a hammer. The audience shifted, a few murmurs rippling through the crowd. Emma's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head as if pretending to consider his point. Clint wasn't finished. "You know what's funny about all this?" he continued, his tone almost amused now. "People love to talk about how we don't need men like that anymore. The strong ones, the quiet ones, the ones who do what has to be done." He paused, letting the weight settle. "Until they need one." Emma stiffened. The audience, hanging on his every word, remained silent. Clint tilted his head slightly. "Tell me," he said, locking eyes with Emma, "when things go wrong, do you want someone who talks?" A pause. "Or someone who acts?" The room exploded. The applause wasn't polite this time, it was thunderous. A ripple of cheers, whistles, even a few standing claps erupted across the audience. Emma's expression flickered. She tried to mask her unease, but it was there, visible under the studio lights. She had lost them. Clint sat back, completely unshaken. Emma needed to regain control. Emma plastered on a smile, but there was strain behind it now. She wasn't rattled, not yet, but the balance of power in the room had shifted completely. She let the applause settle before raising a hand in a calculated gesture of diplomacy. "Clint," she said, her voice measured, "I think we can both agree that strength has its place." She let her words breathe, as if trying to soften the moment. "But times change, and maybe the kind of hero you played, well, maybe people are looking for something different now." Clint raised an eyebrow, waiting. Emma took that as an opening. "We need new heroes," she continued, her confidence creeping back into her tone. "Ones who don't solve problems with their fists. Ones who use words instead of weapons. After all, isn't that what real progress looks like?" She let the rhetorical question linger, offering the audience a moment to nod along. But Clint? He just smirked. It was the kind of knowing smirk that only a man who had seen generations of nonsense come and go could pull off. The kind that said, "I've heard this before." And then he leaned in. "Really?" he said, his voice low, steady, dangerously sharp. Emma blinked. "Tell that," Clint continued, his gaze locking onto her, "to the people who call 911 when they're in trouble." Gasps. The audience froze. A few scattered claps broke the silence. Then a murmur, then a roar. Applause, cheers, nods of agreement. Emma visibly tensed, and for the first time, her composed exterior cracked. She opened her mouth to counter, but the moment had already passed. Clint wasn't just answering her anymore. He was leading the conversation now. Emma Clarke wasn't smiling anymore. The carefully constructed walls of her argument, built on the assumption that Clint Eastwood would fold, backtrack, or play along, were crumbling right in front of her. And Clint knew it. He leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually on the armrest, the other hand lightly tapping against his knee. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to rub it in, because he had already won. The studio was silent now, except for the soft murmur of the audience, still buzzing from his last line. Emma forced a chuckle, an attempt to reset. "Look, Clint," she said, shaking her head slightly, as if to reframe the conversation. "I get it. You believe in the old ways, but we can't ignore the fact that times have changed, that the world is different now." She gestured toward the crowd, as if inviting them to agree with her. Clint let the words linger. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he spoke. "You can rewrite history all you want, sweetheart." The audience froze. Emma's expression stiffened. Clint let his gaze settle on her, his voice steady as steel. "But the truth is simple. Without strong men, there wouldn't be a history to rewrite." Boom. A split second of dead silence. Then, the explosion. The audience erupted. Cheers, applause, stomping feet. People were on their feet, clapping, whistling, some turning to each other with wide eyes, as if to say, "Did he really just say that?" Emma Clarke, for the first time in her entire career, sat there speechless. Her mouth opened slightly, as if reaching for a response, some last-minute comeback, a way to regain control. But there was nothing left to say, because Clint Eastwood had just ended the conversation. It didn't take long for the moment to explode beyond the walls of the studio. Within minutes, clips of Clint's final line were all over the internet. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, every platform lit up with the same phrase. Clint Clapback was trending worldwide. Posts flooded in. Clint Eastwood just shut down woke Hollywood in one sentence. You can rewrite history all you want, sweetheart. Chills. This man is 94 years old and still making people look like amateurs. Within an hour, news outlets had picked up the story. Some praised Clint. Eastwood proved that old-school masculinity isn't dead. Clint's masterclass in composure leaves talk show hosts stunned. Others tried to spin it differently. Emma Clarke faces unfair backlash after controversial interview. Did Clint go too far? The internet is divided. But the internet wasn't divided at all. People knew what they had seen. Talk show analysts dissected the exchange, YouTubers uploaded reaction videos, and podcast hosts debated a single question. Is traditional masculinity really outdated? And then, as if scripted for perfection, a journalist caught up with Clint a week later, spotting him outside a cafe in Carmel, California. The cameras rolled. Mr. Eastwood, do you have anything to say about your viral moment? Clint barely looked up, adjusting his jacket, sipping his black coffee. Then with a small smirk, he said, I don't argue with people who don't want to listen. And just like that, he walked away. Because legends don't explain themselves. They just keep writing. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.